old and well advanced in years, and Jesse's 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to the war. The firstborn was... I've forgotten what the firstborn was now, Eliab. First was Eliab, the second was Abinadab. Gee, you do this to me every time, Jane. And the third, Shammah. And David was the youngest, and the 3 oldest followed Saul. But David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's sheep in Bethlehem. For 40 days the Philistines came forward every morning and evening and took his stand. And Jesse said to his son David, "Take this ephah of roasted grain to those 10 loaves of bread for your brothers and hurry to their camp. Take along these 10 cheeses to the commander of their unit and see how your brothers are and bring back some assurance from them. And they are with Saul and all the men of Israel in the valley of Elah fighting against the Philistines." So early in the morning, David left the flock with a shepherd, loaded up and set out. And as Jesse had directed him, he reached the camp as the army was going out to do its battle position, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines of facing each other. David left his things with the keeper of supplies, ran to the battle lines and greeted his brothers. As he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it. And when the Israelites saw the man, they all ran from him in great fear. Now the Israelites had been saying, "Do you see how this man keeps coming out? He comes out to defy Israel. The king will give great wealth to the man who kills him. He will also give him his daughter in marriage and will exempt his father's family from taxes in Israel." David asked the men standing near him, what will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And they repeated to him what they had been saying and told him, "This is what will be done for the man who kills him." And when Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger at him and said, "Why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the desert? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down just to watch the battle." "Now what have I done?" said David. Can't I even speak?" He then turned away to somebody else and brought up the same matter, and the men answered him as before. And what David said was overheard and reported to Saul, and Saul sent for him. And David said to Saul, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." And Saul replied, "You are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a boy, and he has been a fighting man from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it. I struck it. I rescued the sheep from its mouth. And when it turned on me, I seized it by its hair. I struck it and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. And the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armour on him and a bronze helmet on his head. And David fastened on his sword over the tunic. He tried walking around because he was not used to it. "I cannot go in these," he said, "because I am not used to them." So he took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand. He chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand, he approached the Philistine. I think we all know where this story is going. You may have heard it before. Meanwhile, the Philistine with his shield bearer in front of him kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was only a boy, ruddy and handsome, and he despised him. And he said to David, Am I a dog? Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. "Come here," he said. "Come here, and I'll give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." And David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with a sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty and the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will hand you over to me, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. Today I will give the carcass of the Philistine army to the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. And all those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, no, for the battle is the Lord's. And he will give all of you into our hands." And as the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead and he fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he had struck down the Philistine and killed him. David ran and stood over him. He took out the Philistine's sword. He drew it from the scabbard, and after he killed him, he cut off his head with the sword. And when the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they turned and fled and ran. And I think that might be the end. Is that enough? Thank you. Can you please welcome Gene, who's now only got 5 minutes left for his sermon.
Morning. Thank you for that, Jerry. I did try and choose a passage that had difficult words in it and was long for you. And I'd love to be able to say at this point, I'm actually not going to preach on that chapter. Oh, I am, sorry. It's a really hard one because when I was going through the passage and thinking about it, we pretty well all know the story of David and Goliath from that point of view. And I was tempted just to read certain verses, or only have certain verses, but when you do that, you don't get the complete story. So I just felt, no, we really need to read this whole lot because there's just so much in there. And I'm just so thankful that I didn't have to read it. And Ron actually gave me an out when he messaged me and said, "Oh, yeah, what's the reading? What's the theme? And would you like someone to read it?" No, absolutely, yeah, absolutely. From that point of view. And Ron also did ask me what the theme was, okay. And I have to admit I was a little bit facetious, and my sense of humour, I suppose, came out a little bit. And as you know, the end of the story with Goliath. So I said to Ron, the theme is how to get ahead in life. Okay. So it's a little bit of a play on the words on that one. And don't think Ron picked it up necessarily, but that's okay until now. So I got away with it. I was happy with that. Part of my sense of humour, I guess. And look, I love the story. There's so much in it that we can draw out of it. And I may just go a little bit longer than 5 minutes, if that's okay, Jerry, to bring some of the things out. David, of course, was already serving in Saul's court, so that's why it says he was going back and forwards to the sheep, because Saul had lost God's favour, and it says that there were times where this evil spirit would come upon him and he'd rage, and his advisors had said, find someone who can play a harp or play music and soothe the king. And someone said, I know of someone, and it was David, who could play the harp. And so David was already in Saul's employ from that point of view. Whenever this evil spirit would come upon Saul, they'd call David, and he would come and play the harp to soothe King Saul. So he already knew the situation. He already knew what was going on, but obviously when you're not involved in something and when you look from a distance, it always looks good and you want to be a part of it. So I think that was part of David's thing. He wasn't in the battle, he wasn't in the army, but when he'd go for Saul, he saw the army, he saw the people in their, if I could say, war games, because they did practice, they did train, so that when battle came on, they were prepared. And in this instance, obviously, he must have heard that there was something going on, and so when his father says to him, hey, I want you to take some food to your brothers. They're there against the Philistines. I want you to take some food. And it almost says he almost rushed to get everything together to go and see. So in one sense, he had a boy's wonder about stuff. I mean, how many of us have dreamed to be heroes? How many of us, when we were younger, dreamed of how we were going to change the world? Or, we would see things and go, wow, I wish I was like that. I wish I was part of that. And so David's the same. He was a young boy, and he would have had those dreams. He would have seen, and his 3 older brothers were in the army. Well, wow, I wish I was. He was the youngest. So, his chances of going to be in the army were actually fairly slim at that stage because he was designated to look after the sheep. And there's several things that I want to share with you and point out to you this morning. Well, Gath, of course, was a familiar place. You might remember some time back in Samuel, it talks about the fact how the Philistines, the Israelites, had gone to war against the Israelites, and the Israelites weren't doing so well, and so they grabbed the Ark of the Covenant, the Ark of God, and they took it into the war with them. And when the Philistines saw that, they were really afraid because they had captured that ark. They knew that there was power there, by the way. And we need to understand that in those days, the gods were seen as local, right? So they were seen as, they stayed in a spot. That's how they saw their gods. So the god of that particular area. That's why when they captured the Ark of the Covenant, by the way, for them, they had captured God, as it were. That's how they perceived things. So they didn't see God as being everywhere. And that's why in those days they often worshipped all these different gods. And when they went into another land and conquered that land, they would also capture their God, right? And we know the story of what happened with the Ark of the Covenant, how the Israelites unfortunately also saw God as being local. And that's why they took the Ark of the Covenant with them, so that God would be present with them. And the ark got captured. Now, one of the cities it ended up in was the city of Gath. And so the Philistines were quite aware of that. The Israelites knew that here's Goliath, and he's standing out there making all these threats and stuff like that. They knew that the Ark of the Covenant had been in Gath. They also knew what had happened, and the Philistines sent the Ark of the Covenant back. That's a whole other story, but just to give you that background. As to with that whole. So there's some interesting things, because to me, one of the things we can grab from this whole passage is about how we deal with problems in our lives, right? It's a really interesting thing for me, because here they are facing a problem. I love if you can think of the fact of these two armies, one on a hill over here, one on a hill over there, and there's a valley in between. When they came to fighting, they would actually storm down into the valley and then fight each other. And that was the way war was done in those days. From that point of view, they would the reason they'd gather on the opposite hills is so that the other side could see how many men they had in the army. Right? And it was only men that served in the army. So they could see and decide, wow, look how many people are there, we're going to have a hard time with this. So the whole idea was displaying your force to the other side I guess, to try and intimidate them from that point of view. So there they are on either side. And it's an interesting thing. It says for 40 days, Goliath had come out and he had a go at them and yelling at them and demanding, send someone to fight me. And again, which was a common thing in those days, they had a particular ethic, whereas if one person was designated as the champion of that army, then they would challenge someone from the other army to come and fight, and if they won, that army had to surrender. So it was very interesting, the kind of way that they worked things in those days. So there's the situation, and David does come and he sees what is going on. Now, it's an interesting thing because our Bibles say, and if you read it when the prophet went to anoint the new king, as it were, he went to Jesse's household, you might remember. Saul, of course, had been anointed as the king. And one of the reasons, you might go back and read, it's quite funny because the prophet's called to anoint Saul, and Saul was quite tall. He actually towered above other people. Not as tall as Goliath, but he was tall. Because it's interesting, because when the prophet calls out to Saul, that he wants to anoint him, Saul's trying to hide, and he couldn't because he was too tall. So, he's trying, I don't know what he did. Did he sort of get down or hide behind a wagon or something like that? But here's this picture of Saul, who's tall, and as the leader. Now, one of the things we don't always see, if you were to look at the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish Bible, you would actually see there's two ways of identifying David. We've translated it as he was the youngest, which he was. But in actual fact, the Hebrew word also means the littlest one. Right? David wasn't big. He was actually small. So what I want you to see is here is Goliath, who is huge, and here is David, who is small. Right? You've got the small against the big. And that becomes important for us as we're looking at our problems, I believe, because sometimes we can feel so overwhelmed by our problems and the stuff that's going on in our lives. We don't have to be big to deal with our problems. David was small, and yet he was prepared to go and fight this huge giant. Right? So no matter how big your problem is, there is a way to face it. It's not always nice facing problems. I have problems come into my life. We all have problems come into our lives. It's how we deal with those problems, how we face those problems that become a real key thing. So it's interesting that for 40 days, Goliath rages against the army, and they're scared, they're terrified of him. Again, looking at the Jewish traditions, the number 40 has a particular meaning. Numbers, the Jewish, and still do, the Jews very much consider numbers. A lot of the stuff written in the Bible, they'll talk about numbers, and they actually mean something from the Jewish point of view, remembering that's Jews who wrote this. All right? So the number 40, and if you think of the fact Jesus went into the wilderness for 40 days and fasted, Moses was on the mountain for 40 days. So the 40 is actually significant, and the significance of this in Jewish numerology is 40 is identified as there is transformation coming. That's what the 40 represents. It represents that transformation is on its way. So they're there for 40 days, right? And Goliath is yelling against them. If only they had remembered that transformation was on its way, because that's what the 40 meant. Right? And that's why it puts it in there. It didn't have to put the 40 days in there, but it's put in there specifically because to the Jews, they would have read that and gone, oh, wow, let's look at this differently, because this means transformation is about to happen, right? Which we know it did. The other interesting thing for me is that you've got the two armies on the two opposing hills and the valley in between. I don't know about you, but sometimes I prefer to be on top of the mountain than in the valley, right? In top of the mountain, you can see everything. You see the beauty, you see just so much. In the valleys, you don't always see. Sometimes the valleys, you can be in shadow from that point of view. But have you ever considered what that valley means? Because in actual fact, it's the valley of Elah. And that may not mean anything to us, and maybe they had forgotten about it as well, but Elah is the Aramaic word for God. In other words, they were camped on either side between the valley of God, the valley where God was going to show his might and his power. Sometimes you might feel in your life with the problems and stuff that you're in the valley and you're slogging away, but have you ever thought you may be in the valley of God? You may be exactly where God wants you to be to actually gain victory in your life. Right? So again, I love the kind of picture that is painted here that normally we don't necessarily see. So David comes along, his brothers, they're frustrated. Of course they're frustrated. They've been hearing the same message for 40 days. Goliath ranting against them all. And their youngest brother and smallest brother comes along and he's going, so what will happen? What reward will someone get if they go and stand in, and the brothers, they're probably frustrated, they're probably tired, they're all the sorts of stuff, that are happening. We're about to go into a battle, I might lose my life. And then there's the youngest brother, and youngest brothers are always a pain, right? So there he is, the youngest one, and what will happen? And they we know what you're like, you've just come to make fun of us. You've just come and you're making, and David goes, well, I don't know, what have I done? And being the youngest brother, I identify with that, from that point of view. What have I done? I haven't done anything. Right? And that's what he was doing. So his normal, what I love about this is the normal picture that is painted here of David. And I like the way that the Jews, they actually say or interpret that word not as the youngest, although it's true. They interpret it as the youngest and the littlest. We've sort of missed the littlest, right? Why is that important? Because look how big Goliath was. So when David comes out, and we may think the sling, who would use a sling? They actually used to have, part of their army were people who used slings, right? Because they were so accurate. And it's now known, that they had their bowmen with the bows, the arrows they could affect, but the slingshot was actually also considered part of the armoury. And they would have a special section of the armoury that specifically only dealt with slingshots because they were accurate. They could actually kill someone. And so David having the slingshot, he'd started as a young kid. Maybe he started because he saw this in the army when he was going backwards and forwards between Saul and his family home. And he could see, what the slingshots were doing because they would have been practicing. That's what armies did. They practiced, right? Before the war actually happened, they would practice. And so he would have seen these practicing. Did he go back and go, wow, I'm going to have a go at this? He didn't have a sword. I mean, kids, I know what kids are like. They pick up a stick and pretend it's a sword and stuff like that. But also the slingshot. That was cheap to make, so he made the slingshot. And he used it and he became proficient at it, not knowing that at one stage this was going to actually be the victory for Israel. Right? So he comes against Goliath, right? Or before he comes against Goliath, Saul calls him because Saul hears what's going on. And he calls him and says, you can't go out, and fight. You really can't. And he said, well, I can. I have defeated lions and I have defeated bears, from that point of view by using my slingshot. I can go and deal with this guy. Which when you think, that's the kind of thing a youngest brother would say, isn't it? It's so annoying. I don't know what your problem is, but I can go and do that. So he does. He says that, and Saul says, "Okay, well, you can't go like that. I need to give you some armour." So he gives him his own armour. So there are several reasons why David couldn't wear the armour. One, because he wasn't familiar with it. Right? He'd never worn armour in his life. Might have pretended to, but he'd never worn armour in his life. The other thing is Saul was actually quite tall and big. And he was taller than what David was. So the armour wouldn't have fitted David properly anyway, from that point of view. The army that was the Israelite army, they didn't have that kind of armour. Usually what they had, the top people would have the armour which was made of bronze or stuff like that. And usually what they had was beaten leather. And they would have a leather overcoat, as it were, that sort of wrapped. So sometimes if you've seen some pictures of the Romans, they had the leather chest brace, I guess, which went over their chest, and the leather things for their legs and stuff like that, because they couldn't afford bronze. They couldn't afford stuff from that point of view. Only the highest in the land, like King Saul and Jonathan, his son, would have actually had that kind of armour. So David gets that armour, and he can't really move with it. He's not familiar with it. Now, the reason I like that as well is because sometimes we think we have to be special and we have to have special tools to be able to deal with the problems in our lives. Whereas in actual fact, God would have you use what you've got. God would have you to use the skills and knowledge you have to be able to win over the problems and the issues in your life. Right? We don't have to look for the special weapons or the special way of dealing with the problems in our lives. God's already equipped you. And by the way, the New Testament says God will never allow in your life something or a problem that you can't handle. Right? Now, it doesn't mean he's not going to give you problems that are out of your scope in that sense. What he's saying is, if problems come into your life, you will be able to handle them, even though when you look at them to start with, you think, I can't handle this, I can't do this. So there they are in the valley of God, and I love that because until I'd really looked at what's the meaning of some of these words, I never realised that that valley was actually the valley of God, the valley of Elah. And I love that because, again, we don't always see when God is with us. We don't always know his presence, even though he is there. And we know God's with us all the time. Sometimes we just don't see it. Right? But God is always with us. God is not confined to the Ark of the Covenant. You know, he's everywhere. And even though we may not realise it, there he is. And he's there when the problems are there. We just don't always see it because sometimes our problems loom so big that we don't realise. And the other thing is this, there are two ways of looking at a problem. We'll all have problems in our lives. And the Israelites looked at Goliath and they could just see how huge he was and that none of them matched his size or his ability to carry those kind of weapons which he did. He had to have someone specially carry his weapons for him, you know, because they were so big. Two ways of looking at the problem. The Israelites looked at Goliath and they said, he's too big to hit. David looked at Goliath and said, he's too big to miss. Two ways of looking at our problems, right? He's too big to hit, so we're going back in fear, or he's too big to miss. I've got every chance in this battle. How do you see your problems? Do you see them as they're too big to, I can't deal with this, it's overcoming me, which by the way is quite natural and quite human. Right? And from what I can see of you this morning, most of you look fairly human. Right? So therefore you're going to have this issue where the problems come and sometimes they threaten to overcome you and sometimes they will overcome you. There's a great song sung by a guy by the name of Billy Gilman when he was a young kid. And one of the things he sings, one of the lines in the song really struck me. It said, when you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. Do you know what? That's really true. Sometimes I can look at my problems and think they're too big, or I can look at the problems and go, do you know what? I can deal with that. Let me give you an example from my own life. So I was always at school, always bad at maths. Always bad at maths. And that was my belief. And I looked at this probably just a few years back and realised, in actual fact, I'd been conned into believing that. And I think I mentioned this in the previous time together, but I had a bad teacher, right? Up until about year 10, I think, I did actually quite well in maths. I had a really good teacher who took the time to explain stuff and things like that. And then year 10, year 11, I had a really bad teacher who'd been seconded to take maths. He wasn't professional from the maths point of view. And I struggled because I couldn't understand some of the concepts. And even though I went and saw him and said, help me, he didn't have the patience. I look back now and thought he actually probably didn't even know how to explain the problem to me. So he would just go, look, Jen, you're just going to have to deal with it. Oh, that really helps. You're just going to deal with it. So I began to fail in maths. And from that point on, after I left school, which is quite strange actually, because I ended up working in a bank. And maybe that's why there's issues with the banking issues. But I always had this belief, I can't do maths, I'm no good in dealing with maths, and no, I'm not really good at dealing with budgets, and I'm no good. I sat back some years ago and had a look at this and thought, oh my goodness, Gene, why are you allowing yourself to be conned by this? You see maths as a problem. And every time it comes up, you sort of go, oh, I can't do this, and I'm not good at budgets, and I'm not good. And then I stopped and thought, hang on a minute, where did you end up after you left school? I ended up in the bank. Which area did you end up in? I ended up in the accounts area, right? And you go, so obviously I must have been good. And then when I was going to leave, because I left the bank to go to college, when I left the bank, or announced I was leaving, I resigned, a couple of them came to me, a couple of the older people came to me and said, we would actually like you to stay. You're really good at what you do, and if you stay, we will give you any position you want anywhere in the state. That's not a bad offer, right? But I knew in my heart God wanted me to go to Bible college, so for me it was a no-brainer. But that should have told me, obviously you are okay at this, and obviously maths is okay, but in my mind I'm going, no, I'm just not really good at this. And we con ourselves sometimes, and we allow those problems, and we go, it's too big to hit, I can't deal with it. And I suddenly realised some years ago, Gene, you're an idiot. Why are you allowing what's happened in the past to make you feel unable to deal with this now? Sometimes our problems can be like that. They look like Goliath. They look so big. And he looked so impressive with all his armour and stuff like that, that we freeze and we go, I don't know that I can do this. I don't know that I can actually overcome this problem. We need to change our perspective, because when you change the way you look at things, the things that you look at actually change. And I suddenly found myself some years back going, do you know what? This is ridiculous, Gene. Stop saying you're not good at maths, you're not good at doing budgets. You've actually done budgets. You've actually been a manager and done budgets and actually helped with this stuff. Why do you still have this belief that you can't do it? We talk ourselves into not being able to do things, when God would have us realise what are your strengths, what's your skills, what's your knowledge. Use those to solve the problem that's in front of you. So I want to challenge you this morning to think about, what is the problem that is standing in front of you? What is the problem that you are dealing with in your life, or maybe not dealing with, because in one sense you're afraid to look at it, because to you it's like a Goliath. It's this huge thing, so I'd rather put it to the side and not look at it, because otherwise I might be overcome by it. Right? So we've got two ways we can look at the problems in our lives. It can either be, this problem is too big to hit, so I'm going to ignore it, or this problem is too big to miss. And with God, that's the difference. With God, we can do things. You know, remember the Bible says with God all things are possible. Maybe we need to change our perspective. Maybe we need to look at some of the things in our lives and go, I've been avoiding that. Maybe now's the time to face up to it, because with God, all things are possible. With God, I actually can hit that problem and solve it. Right? Now, I know that sounds simplistic in some ways, but I have found from personal experience that it really, really does work. I remember someone saying, and I love the saying, someone said to another person, how are you going? And the person replied and said, well, no, I'm not bad under the circumstances. And the person replied and said, what are you doing under there? Right? So under the circumstances, or are we over the circumstances? Are we looking at the circumstances around us and saying, I just can't deal with that? Or are we looking at the circumstances in our lives and going, actually, with God's help, I can deal with this? It's about changing our perspective, seeing the Goliaths in our life like David did. And by the way, other people might ridicule you. Sometimes your family can be the worst people because they know you. You know, from that point of view. David's brothers, they were the worst ones, saying, yeah, insolent brat you are. You're our younger brother, we know what you're like. You know? And he could have listened to them and gone, yeah, you're right. You know, I'm a dreamer. And he didn't do that. In fact, it's quite funny, because really what he does, he puts on this innocent face. You know? When they say, what are you doing? We know what you're doing. He goes, what, me? Right? And as a younger brother, I used to practice that a lot, so that if I got into trouble, maybe if I pretended to be innocent, I'd get away with it. You know, There was one particular time that I can remember, it's got nothing to do with this passage, when as a kid I felt petrol was really expensive, and my father had a car, used to park on the back lawn, and I'd go with him sometimes to the petrol station and he'd fill up, and I mean, even back then, this is quite a few years back, but I'd go, oh wow, it's so expensive. My father would say that all the time, the petrol's so expensive. So I thought I'd help him. Fortunately, it was during winter. So what I did though is I unscrewed the petrol cap, no one was around, got the hose, put it in the power and turned the tap on and filled the petrol tank, because I thought, well, let's all dissolve it and it'll make it cheaper, right? From a kid's point of view. My father never ever found out that I had done that, right? Because I convinced him that it's been raining, the rain must have got in. That point of view. I learned early on in life to practice the, what, me? You know, I didn't do anything, right? Younger brothers are really, really good at doing that. That's exactly what David did. You know, when his older brother challenged him, he's going, what, me? All I did is say what's going on out here. Right? So here's the difference though. David didn't just pretend about it, he actually decided to do something about it. So I want to challenge you this morning, whatever the problem is you might have in your life, are you prepared to do something about it? Because that's the first step, being prepared to do something about it. Second step is realising problems that come into your life, they may seem big to you. Someone else may look at that problem and go, oh, that's not an issue. And in yourself, you're going, yes, it is, right? Because your problems are big to you. Again, depends on your perspective. But you have skills, you have knowledge, you have experience that you can use to bring against that problem, plus God. When you've got God, no problem is insurmountable. I'm not saying it's going to be solved instantly, but no problem is insurmountable from that point of view. Allow God to be God in your life. Face the problems rather than denying them or steering clear of them, because try and steer clear of them, they'll always be there. The Israelites tried to steer clear of them, and there was Goliath every day for 40 days yelling at them, making them feel small, making them feel insignificant, until David came along. And he was small. He went up against this huge problem and dealt with it with the skills he had. Also, don't forget what he said, I come against you in the name of the Lord God. That's what we need to do with our problems as well, to come against those problems with ourselves, but also saying, I come against you in the name of the Lord God. Does that make sense, folks? So can I remind you, two ways of looking at the problem. It's either too big to hit or it's too big to miss. But if you decide to go for it with God. God is what makes the difference. God is able to turn around what seems impossible in your life to become possible. You know, I think I did share with you again in one of the early times when I was here about how I'd gone forward in the church. And the minister said to me, why have you come forward? And I said, I think God's calling me to preach and to speak. And he knew the family, he knew me, and he looked at me, smiled gently and said, Gene, I don't think so. Now, at that stage, I could have taken that as a dissuasion. Wow, that makes me feel down. I didn't, because I was a younger brother. And I know how younger brothers act. At times they can be conceited and annoying. And that was one particular day where I was conceited and annoying. I thought, no, I'm going to do this. Later on in life, I discovered that, yes, I could do it with God. Couldn't do it in my own right, but I could do it with God. So I want to encourage you this morning, problems in your life, face them. Don't think they're too big. You have God on your side. That's all you need to be able to really win the battles that are in your life. No matter how vast the army looks on the other hill, just remember the valley of God is between you and that problem. So take the opportunity and go to that problem with God as your armour bearer in one sense. Okay. Father, thank you for this morning. Thank you for the life of David. Thank you for the fantastic example we have of how he faced that problem in his life. And it was a problem for the whole of Israel, but we thank you that he realised with you all things are possible. With you, he could deal with the biggest problem he'd ever seen up until that point. Lord, help us also to realise we can face the problems in our lives. They may not disappear straight away. But once we're walking in that area of transformation, which is what you do and what your Holy Spirit does in us, help us to realise that those problems can be dealt with. They may not go away overnight, but if we are persistent and consistent, as your love is and as you are, we will win. Lord, help us to realise that. Help us to see our problems in a different light this morning, because we ask this in your name. Amen.